Okay, so imagine this. You solve one of the hardest mathematical problems in a century. A problem so massive, it comes with the highest honors your field can possibly offer. And then, you just vanish. This is the incredible story of Grigori Perelman, a mathematician who literally redefined our understanding of the universe and then just rejected everything the world wanted to give him for it.
Let's start with this number, $1 million. That was the prize money put up by the Clay Mathematics Institute for solving any one of its 7 Millennium Prize problems. We're talking about the absolute toughest, most fundamental questions in all of modern mathematics. And yeah, that $1 million prize, plus the Fields Medal, which is basically the Nobel Prize for math, was on the table for one man. The man who finally cracked a geometric puzzle that had stumped the greatest minds for over 100 years, the Poincaré Conjecture. Which brings us to the absolute core mystery here. What could possibly lead someone to reject that kind of fortune and recognition, the ultimate validation in their life's work? To figure that out, we have to get inside the head of the man who solved the unsolvable. So, to really understand his choice, we've got to go back to the beginning. Grigori Perelman's story doesn't start in some cushy modern university. It starts in the incredibly demanding, intellectually supercharged environment of the Soviet Union. Perelman was born in Leningrad to a family that just lived and breathed logic. His mom was a math teacher, his dad an engineer. So from day one, his world was all about proofs and principles. And his coach, a guy named Sergei Rukshin, saw something special in him right away, a demand for what he called perfect rigor, an absolute no-compromises standard for truth that would define his entire career. And it was here he also picked up a lifelong habit, taking these long, solitary walks, using the rhythm of the city to untangle the craziest mathematical knots in his head. And his rise was, well, just insane. At only 16, he gets a perfect score at the International Mathematical Olympiad. A perfect score. Then by 1994, he proved something called the Soul Conjecture, with a solution so clean and elegant it just stunned the entire math world. The guy was already a giant in his field long before he decided to tackle the biggest problem of them all. So, what do you do when you're already a giant in your field? You find a mathematical Mount Everest to climb. And for Perelman, that was the problem that had defied the world's best for 100 years, the Poincaré Conjecture. All right, so what is this thing? The Poincaré Conjecture. In the simplest terms, it's all about the basic nature of 3D shapes. Think about it like this. Take a loop of string and put it on a basketball. You can always slide it around and shrink that loop down to a tiny point, right? But now try that on a donut. If the loop goes through the middle hole, it's stuck. You can't shrink it to a point. The conjecture basically says that any 3D object where every single loop can be shrunk down like on the basketball must, topologically, just be a 3D sphere. It's like a fundamental litmus test for the shape of our universe.
For decades, this thing was just untouchable. Nobody knew how to prove it. Then, a mathematician named Richard Hamilton had this brilliant idea called the Ricci flow. The best way to think about it is like a mathematical process that takes any weird lumpy shape and starts smoothing it out over time, kind of like how heat spreads through a piece of metal to even out the temperature. The hope was that this flow would eventually smooth any weird shape into a perfect sphere.
And Hamilton's method was a total game changer. You'd start with your complex shape, turn on the Ricci flow, and just watch it get simpler. But, and this is a huge but, there was a massive problem. The flow would often develop these things called singularities, these points where the curvature suddenly becomes infinite and the whole process just breaks. It just stops cold. These singularities were like mathematical black holes, and for years, nobody could figure out how to get past them.
So for years, those singularities were the brick wall. They stopped all progress. That is, until Grigori Perelman, working pretty much all by himself back in Russia, came up with an idea that was just breathtakingly clever.
And this is where the genius really kicks in. Instead of trying to avoid the singularities, Perelman figured out how to control them. His method, which he called Ricci flow with surgery, was just wow. He could let the flow run until a problem was about to form, pause it, surgically snip out that nasty infinite point, cap the little hole, and then just restart the flow. He was literally performing surgery on the fabric of geometry itself.
And then he did something that just shattered every academic tradition. He didn't submit his work to some fancy, prestigious journal. Nope. He just posted 3 papers on a public, open-access website, basically laying out the entire proof for anyone in the world to read. Each paper built on the last,
just systematically knocking down every single piece of the puzzle, from a wild new entropy formula all the way to the final proof that his surgical method would always work. The entire mathematical community was just electrified. People were floored. When Perelman finally toured the US to explain his work, his lectures were called dazzling. The logic was so powerful, the insight so deep, that the top experts in the room knew almost right away that he'd done it. The century-old problem was solved. But here's the thing. Perelman's quiet, unconventional way of releasing the proof created a kind of vacuum. He basically showed the world the answer, dropped the mic, and walked away. It took the community years to meticulously check his incredibly dense arguments. And in that time, that vacuum of credit and recognition started to fill with something else, a really bitter controversy. This is where things get messy. A major dispute over credit erupted. While several independent teams were confirming that Perelman's proof was, in fact, correct and complete, another group, led by the very prominent mathematician Xingtong Yao, published what they called the complete proof. Yao even publicly suggested that Perelman's contribution was maybe only 25% of the total effort. This move was widely seen as a pretty blatant attempt to reassign credit, especially since their paper seemed to borrow very heavily from the verification work of the other teams. And it was this ugly public fight over fame and legacy that Perelman just found completely repulsive. And it's the critical context we need to understand the absolutely shocking decision that came next.
So in 2006, the mathematical community makes it official. They award him the Fields Medal. He turns it down. 4 years later, the Clay Institute offers him the $1 million Millennium Prize. And again, he says no. This was just unheard of, a totally unprecedented act in the history of science. So why on earth did he do it? This wasn't some act of madness. It was a series of very clear, principled choices. First, you have his core philosophy. If the proof is correct, then no other recognition is necessary. The work stands on its own. Second, he was just disgusted by what he saw as a total lack of integrity in the community. Third, he felt it was just plain unfair that Richard Hamilton, the guy whose Richie flow was the starting point, wasn't offered a share of the prize. And finally, he just absolutely hated the idea of being a public figure. And this famous quote, it just says it all. He told a journalist, "I don't want to be on display like an animal in a zoo. I'm not a hero of mathematics." For him, the awards weren't an honor, they were a cage. And so, he made his choice. In December 2005, even before the big awards were officially announced, he resigned from his job. He cut off all contact with his colleagues and just retreated into a quiet life with his mother in St. Petersburg, effectively vanishing from the world of professional mathematics. Perelman's story really forces us to ask a pretty deep question. What is the true reward for a great discovery? Is it the medals, the money, the fame, or is it something else? Is it just the quiet, personal satisfaction of being the first human being to solve a puzzle that the universe itself laid out for us? For Grigori Perelman, the answer couldn't have been more clear.